The late autumn wind whistled through the bare maple branches surrounding the Turner estate, a sprawling Victorian mansion nestled in the hills of western Massachusetts. The year was 1895, and the small town of Blackfield had just endured its harshest October in memory. Frost had come early, blackening crops and sending farmers into panic. All except for the Turners, whose harvest remained mysteriously abundant despite the devastating cold. James Whittaker pulled his wool coat tighter as he approached the imposing wrought iron gates. As the town's newly appointed physician, he had been summoned to attend to the family's patriarch, Elias Turner, who reportedly suffered from a worsening respiratory condition. The invitation to the estate was rare. The Turners seldom welcomed outsiders, especially during their annual harvest feast preparations. "Dr. Whittaker, we've been expecting you." The voice belonged to Margaret Turner, Elias's daughter-in-law, a tall woman with severe features and calculating eyes. She stood in the doorway, her black dress stark against the mansion's mahogany interior. "Father Turner's condition has deteriorated since yesterday." The mansion's interior smelled of beeswax, dried herbs, and something else, something James couldn't quite place. As he followed Margaret up the grand staircase, he noticed peculiar markings etched into the wood of each step-old symbols, meticulously maintained despite their apparent age. "The family is preparing for our harvest feast tomorrow," Margaret explained, noticing his wandering gaze. "It's tradition. We never postpone, not even for illness." They passed a hallway where several servants were hanging dried corn husks and arranging peculiar metal implements that resembled both farming tools and butcher's instruments. The servants averted their eyes as the doctor passed. Elias Turner's bedroom was oppressively warm, a fire roaring despite the relatively mild day. The old man lay propped against pillows, his skin pallid except for fever-bright spots on his sunken cheeks. His eyes, however, remained sharp and alert. "Doctor," he rasped, "you're just in time. The feast approaches." His gaze shifted to a sealed door across from his bed. "Have you told him about our kitchen, Margaret?" Margaret's face tightened. "Father, the doctor is here for your lungs, nothing more." James noted the tension with professional curiosity. "Mr. Turner, I'll need to examine your chest. How long have you had this cough?" "Since the first frost," Elias answered, his eyes never leaving the sealed door. "But it always worsens before the feast. Always has for 40 years now." As James leaned in with his stethoscope, Elias grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "The kitchen door must remain sealed until the feast. Family tradition. Do you understand? Even if you hear sounds." Before James could respond, a series of dull thuds emanated from behind the sealed door, followed by what sounded like scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. Margaret immediately moved to the room's phonograph and cranked it vigorously, filling the room with screeching orchestral music. "The wind," she explained, her voice tight. "It creates strange acoustics in this old house." But James had practiced enough medicine to recognize fear when he saw it, and in the eyes of both Elias and Margaret Turner he saw terror barely contained behind their aristocratic composure. That evening James found himself unexpectedly invited to stay overnight. A sudden snowstorm had made the roads back to town impassable, Margaret had explained, though the real reason seemed to be Elias's deteriorating condition. The old man's breathing had become increasingly labored, and James worried about pneumonia setting in. He was given a guest room on the second floor, directly above what he presumed was the sealed kitchen. The Turner family dined in a separate dining hall, explaining that the main kitchen had been temporarily closed for special preparations for tomorrow's feast. After a tense dinner where conversation deliberately avoided any mention of the sealed room, the family dispersed to their quarters. Only Charlotte Turner, Elias's 16-year-old granddaughter, lingered as James prepared to return to his patient. "Dr. Whittaker," she whispered, glancing nervously at the hallway. "You need to leave before dawn tomorrow." Her blue eyes were wide with genuine concern. Unlike the other Turners, whose expressions remained carefully controlled, Charlotte's fear was raw and unfiltered. "My grandfather's condition requires monitoring," James replied cautiously. "It's not about grandfather." Charlotte's voice trembled. "It's about what happens in the kitchen during the feast. Every year someone new must attend. This year they invited you because, Charlotte." Margaret's sharp voice cut through the air. She stood at the end of the hallway, her face like stone. "To your room now." Charlotte cast one last desperate look at James before hurrying away, leaving him with more questions than answers. Later that night, unable to sleep, James decided to check on Elias once more. The mansion was eerily silent except for the occasional creaking of settling wood and the persistent howl of wind outside. As he passed the main staircase, he noticed a faint glow from below. Following the light, he found himself in a narrow corridor he hadn't seen before. It led toward the sealed kitchen but diverted to what appeared to be a cellar entrance. The door stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling from within. Cautiously, James descended the stone steps. The cellar was vast, stretching beneath the entire mansion, lined with preserves and root vegetables. But what caught his attention was a small group huddled around a table at the far end. Margaret, her husband William, and 2 servants, all bent over what appeared to be architectural drawings. "The seal on the north wall is weakening," William was saying, his voice tight with urgency. "If it breaks before the feast, double quotes." Margaret shook her head. "It won't. The offering will be made on time as always, and if the doctor becomes suspicious?" one of the servants asked. William's response chilled James to the core. Then he joins the feast in a different capacity. A floorboard creaked beneath James's foot. 4 heads snapped up simultaneously, their expressions transforming from conspiracy to practiced pleasantness with disturbing speed. "Dr. Whitaker," Margaret's voice was honey over steel, "you should be resting. Tomorrow's feast is quite an event, and we need you, alert." James forced a smile. "Just restless, I'm afraid." "I thought I'd check on Mr. Turner once more." "I'll accompany you," William offered too quickly. These old houses can be confusing at night. As they ascended the stairs, James couldn't shake the feeling that the kitchen door wasn't keeping something out. It was keeping something in. Dawn broke with a crimson stain across the snow-laden landscape. James had barely slept, his mind racing with questions about the Turners and their sealed kitchen. He had checked on Elias twice more during the night, each time finding the old man awake, his eyes fixed on the sealed door, murmuring what sounded like prayers or incantations. During his last visit around 4 a.m., James had pressed his ear against the kitchen door while Elias dozed fitfully. What he heard defied explanation, a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but too deep, too resonant for any human lungs. And beneath that, a wet, slithering noise that made his skin crawl. Now, as servants bustled about preparing for the feast, James observed the family with new eyes. They moved with the precision of actors in a well-rehearsed play, their movements betraying decades of ritual. Even young Charlotte had been transformed overnight, her earlier fear replaced by a detached serenity that seemed almost drugged. "Doctor, you seem troubled," William commented over breakfast, which was served in a small parlor. The dining hall was being decorated, and the sealed kitchen remained off-limits. "I trust you slept well?" "Well enough," James lied. "Mr. Turner's condition concerns me. The feast preparations must be quite taxing for him in his state." William and Margaret exchanged glances. "Father insists on performing his role," Margaret said carefully. "Family tradition is non-negotiable." After breakfast, James seized an opportunity to speak with one of the kitchen maids, an older woman named Ruth, who seemed less entranced than the others. He cornered her in a hallway, away from prying eyes. "The sealed kitchen," he whispered urgently. "What's inside?" Ruth's weathered face drained of color. "It's not a what, doctor? Not anymore." She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "The Turner who came before Elias, his grandfather. He brought something back from his travels in 28, something hungry." "I don't understand," James pressed. "They made a bargain," Ruth continued, her voice barely audible. "Prosperity in exchange for sustenance. The town's crops fail, but the Turners always thrive. Haven't you wondered why?" A floorboard creaked nearby. Ruth immediately began dusting a nearby table, her moment of candor vanishing behind a mask of servility. James pretended to examine a painting as William appeared around the corner. "Ah, doctor. Father's asking for you." When James entered Elias's room, he found the old man sitting upright, dressed in formal attire despite his illness. His breathing was labored, but his eyes burned with feverish determination. "The feast begins at sundown," Elias said without preamble. "You will attend as our honored guest, Mr. Turner, in your condition." "My condition is irrelevant," Elias cut him off. "What matters is tradition, continuity, the bargain." He gestured to an armchair near his bed. "Sit, doctor. There's something you should know before tonight." For the next hour, Elias spoke of his family's history, of crop failures and desperation, of his grandfather's expedition to acquire means of survival. He spoke of sacrifices and prosperity, his words circling around some terrible truth without ever quite revealing it. "Every family has its secrets, doctor," Elias concluded, his voice growing hoarse. "Ours just happens to be hungrier than most." Outside, the servants were erecting a curious structure in the courtyard, a wooden frame reminiscent of a slaughterhouse stanchion, positioned directly beneath the kitchen window. By late afternoon, the storm had intensified. Snow swirled in vicious eddies around the mansion, sealing them in more effectively than any locked door. The feast preparations continued with increasing urgency as sundown approached. James noticed that several burly men who hadn't been present earlier had arrived and were stationed throughout the house. He also observed that all the clocks in the mansion had been stopped at precisely 7:13. Charlotte found him in the library, where he'd been searching for any historical records that might explain the Turner family's peculiar traditions. She moved like a sleepwalker, her earlier animation completely gone, but her eyes still held a glimmer of awareness. "They drugged my tea," she whispered, swaying slightly. "They always do before the feast. But I spit most of it out." She clutched his arm. "You have to see so you can tell others. Grandfather's dying, and someone has to inherit his role." "What role, Charlotte? What happens during the feast?" "The kitchen door opens at 7:13, she said, her words slurring slightly. "When the hunger is strongest. One enters to feed it so the rest may eat. Grandfather has been the keeper since his father died, but now ... A bell rang somewhere in the house, its tone resonating with unnatural depth. "They're summoning everyone," Charlotte said, panic breaking through her drugged state. "The feast is beginning early. The storm's making it restless." They hurried downstairs to find the family assembled in the dining hall. The long table was set with the finest china and silver, but remained conspicuously empty of food. Elias sat at the head, looking cadaverous but alert, a heavy iron key on a chain around his neck. "Charlotte, your place is here," Margaret said coldly, indicating a chair far from Elias. She turned to James with a practiced smile. "Doctor, as our guest of honor, you'll sit at Father's right hand." The assembled family and select servants, about 20 people, and all took their places. James noted that the exits were now guarded by the burly men he'd seen earlier. William locked the dining room doors with ceremonial flourish. "The harvest feast of 1895 begins," Elias announced, his voice surprisingly strong. "May our offering be found acceptable." He turned to James, lowering his voice. "When the kitchen door opens, Doctor, do not look directly at what emerges. The human mind struggles with certain geometries." Before James could respond, a tremendous crash echoed from the direction of the sealed kitchen, followed by the splintering of wood. Several family members gasped. One of the younger children began to cry, but was quickly hushed. "It's breaking through early," William said, his composure finally cracking. "Father, the key." Elias clutched the iron key, his knuckles white. "It's too soon. The offering isn't ready." Another crash, closer now. The dining room doors shuddered, as if struck by something massive. A foul odor seeped into the room, the smell of wet earth, rot, and something metallic like old blood. "What offering?" James demanded, rising from his seat. "What have you people done?" Elias fixed him with a desperate gaze. "Every prosperity demands sacrifice, Doctor. For 70 years the bargain has held. One life, freely given, feeds it for another year. I've been giving my blood, my essence, bit by bit, but now, ... A ball quotes, he clutched his chest, wheezing. "I'm spent. It knows." The doors shuttered again. Wood splintered around the hinges. "It must be appeased," Margaret declared, standing abruptly. "We need a substitute keeper. Someone with strength to spare." Her gaze fixed on James. "The doctor," William agreed, signaling to the guards. "Father has chosen him a successor. That's why he was summoned." As the guards moved toward him, James backed away, knocking over his chair. "This is madness." "It's survival," Elias wheezed. "The hunger must be controlled, channeled. Otherwise it consumes indiscriminately." The doors exploded inward. What came through the shattered dining room doors defied comprehension. James caught only glimpses, glistening surfaces that seemed both solid and liquid, appendages that bent at impossible angles, and eyes, so many eyes reflecting the candlelight like pools of oil. His mind recoiled from the full image, fragmenting it into manageable pieces, while his instincts screamed for flight. The Turner family had fallen to their knees, heads bowed, all except Elias, who stood trembling before the abomination. The old man raised the iron key, his voice cracking as he recited words in a language James didn't recognize. The thing paused, a writhing mass of contradiction suspended in the doorway. Its attention, a tangible force that made the air vibrate, fixed on Elias. "The bargain stands," Elias addressed it, "but my time ends. I present a successor." With surprising swiftness, he tossed the key to James, who caught it reflexively. The creature's focus shifted. James felt its attention like a physical weight pressing against his mind, probing for weakness. The key burned cold in his palm. "Put it on," Elias urged. "Quickly, man. It accepts only the keeper, or it takes whoever it chooses." One of the guards seized Charlotte, pushing her forward. "We have another offering if the doctor refuses," William announced coldly. "No," James found his voice. Charlotte's terrified face galvanized him into action. Whatever this horror was, the girl didn't deserve to face it. He slipped the chain over his head, the key coming to rest against his chest. The effect was immediate. The creature shuddered and contracted, seeming to fold in on itself like paper in a fire. A sound like rushing water filled the room as it retreated toward the kitchen, leaving a trail of viscous fluid that steamed on the polished floor. "Follow it," Elias commanded weakly. "The first feeding establishes the bond. Without it, the bargain fails." The Turner family watched him with desperate hope, their aristocratic composure abandoned in the face of primal fear. James realized the terrible truth. They were as much prisoners of this arrangement as whoever was sacrificed to maintain it. Drawing upon reserves of courage he hadn't known he possessed, James followed the retreating horror. The key around his neck pulsed with each step, growing warmer against his skin. He passed through the splintered doorway, down the hall, and into the antechamber before the sealed kitchen. The kitchen door hung from a single hinge, revealing darkness beyond. From within came sounds of movements, slithering, squelching noises that made his gorge rise. The stench of decay was overwhelming. "What happens now?" James called back to the Turners, who had followed at a safe distance. "You feed it a small piece of yourself," William explained, his voice clinically detached. "Blood, primarily. It will take what it needs, then return to dormancy until the next feeding. And this happens every year? Just once? Monthly?" Elias wheezed from the back of the group. "Winter requires more. During harvest, the major feeding sats it until spring." James stood on the threshold, medical rationality warring with the impossible evidence before him. "And if I refuse?" Margaret's laugh was brittle. "It feeds regardless, doctor. Without the keeper's control, it chooses indiscriminately. The key channels its hunger, directs it toward a single source rather than everyone." James thought of Charlotte, of the town beyond these walls. Slowly, he stepped through the broken door into the kitchen. The room beyond was cavernous, far larger than seemed possible given the mansion's dimensions. The walls glistened with the same viscous fluid that had trailed behind the creature. In the center of the room, the thing waited, a pulsating mass of tissue that seemed to absorb what little light penetrated this space. The key against his chest grew painfully hot as he approached. Instinctively, James understood what was required. Taking his medical scalpel from his bag, he made a precise incision across his palm. Blood welled immediately. He extended his hand toward the creature. What happened next would haunt his dreams for years to come. The first feeding left James drained but alive. The creature had latched onto his bleeding palm with an appendage that felt like hot silk, drawing blood with gentle insistence until he grew lightheaded. Then, seeming satisfied, it had released him and retreated to a corner of the kitchen, folding into itself until it resembled nothing more threatening than a pile of dark cloth. The Turners had bandaged his hand and treated him with a mixture of newfound respect and wary distance. He was now part of their secret, bound to it by blood and necessity. Elias, relieved of his burden, had taken to his bed, his condition stabilizing now that the creature no longer drew from him. "You'll stay with us, of course," Margaret had said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. The keeper must remain close to what they keep. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now, as December's first snow blanketed the estate, James sat in what had become his study, reviewing the journals of previous keepers that William had reluctantly provided. The history of the Turner family's bargain was recorded in meticulous, clinical detail, a chronicle of controlled horror spanning 3 generations. From these accounts, James pieced together the truth. In 1828, during a devastating famine, Jeremiah Turner had traveled to South America seeking agricultural innovations that might save his failing estate. What he found instead, in a temple hidden deep in the Amazon rainforest, was an entity the locals worshipped and feared, a being they fed with blood sacrifices in exchange for bountiful harvests. Jeremiah had somehow captured a portion of this entity, or perhaps it had allowed itself to be taken, sensing greater feeding opportunities abroad. He had constructed a special chamber within his home to contain it, establishing the ritual that would sustain both the creature and the Turner prosperity for decades to come. The kitchen had been built around this chamber, the mundane act of food preparation serving as camouflage for the true nourishment happening within. Each keeper learned to provide just enough of themselves to sat the entity without being consumed entirely. Precarious balance maintained through the power of the key, which seemed to exert some control over the creature's hunger. James discovered that his predecessor's decline had not been natural illness but the cumulative effect of decades of feeding the entity. No keeper had ever died of old age. They were inevitably consumed entirely, their position passing to another when they had nothing left to give. His medical training rebelled against this fate, and he began to formulate a plan. If the creature could be contained, perhaps it could also be destroyed. or at least studied, understood, and potentially controlled through means other than self-sacrifice. Charlotte became his unlikely ally. The girl's intelligence and courage impressed him, and she alone among the Turners seemed to view their family's arrangement with appropriate horror rather than resigned acceptance. "It's getting stronger," she confided one evening, having slipped into his study after the rest of the household had retired. "I've studied the records. Each generation, the feedings increase in frequency. What began as an annual sacrifice now happens monthly. Eventually, it will break free entirely," James finished. "Unless we find a way to end this." Their research led them to an elderly woman living in Blackfield's poorest quarter, Brazilian immigrant named Isabel, who had once served as kitchen staff at the Turner estate decades earlier. Her eyes widened at the sight of the key around James's neck, now concealed beneath his clothing but somehow visible to her. "You carry the hunger chain," she whispered, crossing herself. "The Akuma must tether." From Isabel they learned the entity's true nature, a spirit of consumption that her people had worshipped as an aspect of nature, the necessary counterbalance to growth and abundance. The key was fashioned from a metal found only in the temple where it was originally contained. Imbued with properties that could channel and temporarily sat the creature's endless hunger. "It cannot be destroyed," Isabel warned them. "To attempt this would release its full power, but it can be returned to its source, where natural checks exist to contain it." Armed with this knowledge, James and Charlotte began making preparations. They would need to transport the entity back to its origin, an impossible task unless they could first render it dormant for the journey. This would require a feeding so substantial that the creature would enter a state of prolonged torpor, like a snake after consuming a large meal. "A feeding without death is mere snacking to the Yakumama," Isabel had explained. "For true dormancy, it requires life completely surrendered." As James contemplated this grim necessity, winter tightened its grip on Blackfield. The new year of 1896 approached, bringing with it the entity's increasing agitation. Quote, "Its demands for feeding grew more frequent, more insistent. Twice now James had found the kitchen door splintered, the creature prowling the hallways before the key called it back. Time was running short. The bargain was breaking down. By mid-January, James's health had begun to deteriorate despite his medical knowledge and careful management of the feedings. The entity took more than blood. It seemed to drain vitality itself, leaving him exhausted and prone to infections. Charlotte watched his decline with growing alarm, her determination to end the Turner family's curse strengthening with each passing day. Their plan crystallized around a fundamental truth. The entity required a complete life sacrifice to enter dormancy. But nowhere was it written that this sacrifice must be unwilling. This distinction became the cornerstone of their strategy. While the Turner family busied themselves with maintaining appearances in town, their social standing remained important despite their isolation. James and Charlotte prepared for a ritual of their own design, combining Isabel's traditional knowledge with James's medical understanding. "The vessel must be prepared," Isabel instructed, mixing herbs in James's study while Charlotte kept watch. "The Yakumama cannot simply be transported like common cargo. It must be contained within something that can channel its essence without rupturing." They selected an antique chest from the mansion's attic, reinforcing it with bands of iron and lining it with symbols Isabel carved with practiced precision. James used his position as keeper to collect secretions from the entity during feedings, viscous fluid that Isabel incorporated into a sealing mixture to line the chest's interior. The Turners, notably, remained oblivious to these preparations. William and Margaret had settled into comfortable denial, treating James as a solution to their problem rather than a temporary steward. Even Elias, though recovering physically, seemed content to ignore the larger implications of the entity's increasing restlessness. Only Charlotte understood the true stakes, that the bargain made by her great-grandfather was deteriorating, and would eventually fail completely, with catastrophic consequences for both family and town. As January gave way to February, an unexpected development forced their hand. One morning Charlotte discovered her grandfather's bed empty, his wheelchair abandoned. A trail of dark fluid led from his room toward the kitchen. She found Elias kneeling before the entity, which had extended multiple tendrils around his frail body. The old man's expression was one of rapturous surrender. "Grandfather?" "No," Charlotte cried, but it was too late. As she watched in horror, Elias Turner was drawn into the pulsating mass, his body seeming to dissolve rather than being consumed in any conventional sense. The entity shuddered with satisfaction, glowing briefly before contracting into a dense sphere about the size of a large pumpkin. Isabel had described this state, the torpor following complete consumption. They had planned to induce it through ritual. Elias had achieved it through sacrifice. Charlotte ran to find James, who immediately recognized the opportunity despite his shock at Ilias's fate. "We have hours at most before it expands again," he said, grabbing the prepared chest. "We must act now." They worked quickly, transferring the dormant entity into the chest. It offered no resistance, remaining in its contracted state as James secured the heavy lid and activated the sealing mechanism Isabel had designed. The key still around his neck, he placed in a specially carved recess on the chest's lid, where it sank into the wood as if melting. "What about the others?" Charlotte whispered, glancing toward the dining hall where the family remained unaware of these developments. James considered the Turner family complicit in decades of feeding this horror, prioritizing their prosperity over countless lives that might have been claimed had the entity ever fully escaped. "They've made their choices," he said finally. "They can make new ones now without this burden. The land will yield what it yields by natural law rather than unnatural bargain." That night, as a winter storm provided cover, James and Charlotte slipped away from the Turner estate. The chest, secured in a reinforced cart, would begin its journey back to its place of origin, a pilgrimage that Isabel had arranged through contacts in the Brazilian expatriate community, passed from hand to trusted hand until it reached the temple from which it had been taken. They left behind a letter explaining what had happened and why, though James doubted William or Margaret would ever truly accept the loss of their supernatural advantage. Without the entity, the Turner lands would be subject to the same vagaries of weather and fortune as their neighbors, of justice of sorts, if insufficient punishment for their willing participation in such horror. As they reached the town limits, Charlotte looked back at the mansion silhouetted against the night sky. "Do you think it will ever return?" she asked, her breath clouding in the frigid air. James touched the spot where the key had rested against his chest for months, feeling both bereft and liberated by its absence. "Not if we succeed," he answered. "Some bargains are meant to be broken." Spring arrived in Blackfield with tentative green shoots pushing through soil no longer unnaturally fertile. The Turner estate, once lush while neighboring farms struggled, now yielded crops in proportion to the work invested, abundant in well-tended areas, meager where neglect had set in. James had not returned to the mansion after that winter night. Instead, he had established a small medical practice in town, using knowledge gained from his time as keeper to treat ailments that had previously baffled him. The entity had taken much from him, but had inadvertently given something in return: insights into the boundary between life and consumption, health and decay. Charlotte had chosen to remain with him rather than return to her family, serving as his assistant and studying medicine with voracious intensity. They maintained a professional relationship in public, but townsfolk whispered about their true connection, some romantic, others more akin to father and daughter. Neither bothered to correct these speculations. News from the Turner estate reached them sporadically. William had assumed control of the family's affairs, explaining his father's absence as an extended European trip for health reasons. Margaret maintained the family's social obligations with rigid determination, though their influence in local society had begun to wane alongside their agricultural supremacy. The kitchen had been demolished, according to servants' gossip, replaced with a modern cooking area elsewhere in the mansion. The sealed door and the chamber beyond were bricked up, buried within new construction as if the family could literally wall off their past. For a time, it seemed the horror had truly ended. The chest containing the dormant entity had begun its long journey south, passing through a chain of guardians Isabel had arranged. Each courier understood they carried something dangerous, something that must be returned to its source rather than destroyed, lest worse consequences follow. But on a rain-soaked evening in late April, James received an unexpected visitor. William Turner appeared in his modest office after hours, soaked from the downpour and wild-eyed with desperation. "It's not gone," he said without preamble. "You took the vessel but left the echo." James felt a familiar cold settle in his stomach. "Explain." William paced the small room, leaving muddy tracks on the floorboards. "We dream of it, Margaret, the children, even the servants. The same dream night after night, a hunger growing beneath the new kitchen, scratching at the bricks." "Dreams are often manifestations of guilt," James suggested, though he felt a prickle of unease. "Your family participated in feeding that thing for generations." "It's not guilt," William insisted. "Something remains. Something spawned, perhaps, or a piece that separated before you took the rest. We found ... residue, black fluid seeping through the new walls." Charlotte entered with a tray of tea, freezing when she saw William. Her expression hardened. "Why is he here?" James explained the situation, while William stared at Charlotte with a mixture of resentment and desperation. The Turners had not forgiven her defection, viewing it as a betrayal of family loyalty. "You stole our protection and left us with the consequences," William said bitterly. "The least you can do is help us now." "Protection?" Charlotte's laugh was cold. "Grandfather sacrificed himself to that thing. How many others before him? How many would have followed? It wasn't protection. It was slow consumption. Despite their reluctance, James and Charlotte agreed to investigate. The possibility that some portion of the entity remained was too dangerous to ignore, regardless of their feelings toward the Turner family. The next day, they approached the mansion for the first time in months. The estate had changed subtly, the gardens less immaculate, the paint showing early signs of neglect. Without their supernatural advantage, the Turners were discovering the cost of maintaining such opulence through purely natural means. Margaret greeted them with tight-lipped civility, her once imperious demeanor tempered by desperation. "It's worse at night," she explained, leading them toward the new kitchen. "The staff refuse to work after sunset. 3 have already left our employ." The new kitchen occupied the mansion's east wing, a modern facility with copper pots hanging from ceiling racks and a massive iron stove dominating one wall. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss till James noticed the subtle discoloration on the floor near the pantry, a darkening of the wood in a pattern too regular to be natural wear. "There," he pointed. "When did this appear?" 2 weeks ago," Margaret answered. "After the spring thaw. At first we thought it was water damage, but it spreads each night, always in the same pattern." James knelt to examine the stain, his medical training warring with knowledge no conventional education could provide. The pattern resembled the same symbols that had been etched into the stairs, the ones he had noticed on his first visit nearly 6 months earlier. "The entity marked this house," he murmured, "not just the kitchen, the entire structure." Charlotte examined the pantry, which shared a wall with what had been the sealed chamber. "This needs to be opened," she said, tapping the plastered wall. "Whatever remains is behind here." William summoned servants with tools, and within an hour they had broken through to the bricked-up chamber. The space beyond was surprisingly small without the entity's presence distorting perception. The bricks were coated with a thin film of black fluid, not actively flowing but present. "Echo residue," James explained, recalling Isabel's teachings. "When a Yakumama feeds in one location for generations, it leaves an imprinted kind of memory in the physical space. Not the entity itself, but an echo of its hunger. How do we remove it?" William demanded. James and Charlotte exchanged glances. "We can't," Charlotte said simply. "This house is permanently marked. The hunger has seeped into its very foundation." "Then what?" Margaret's composure finally broke. "We abandon our ancestral home, our legacy?" "Your legacy," James said quietly, "is built on feeding an abomination. Perhaps losing this house is the least you should sacrifice in atonement." The Turners refused to abandon their ancestral home despite James and Charlotte's warnings. Instead, they embarked on increasingly desperate measures to cleanse the mansion of the entity's residual presence. They consulted spiritualists, imported holy water from European cathedrals, and even attempted to burn away the contamination with controlled fires in affected areas. Nothing worked. By midsummer, the black stains had spread throughout the house, following invisible pathways that seemed to map the entity's former movements. Dreams plagued everyone who slept under the Turner roof. Dreams of hunger and consumption that left them hollow-eyed and irritable. James monitored the situation from a distance, visiting weekly to document the progression. He had begun corresponding with scholars who studied similar phenomena, carefully anonymizing the details to protect both the Turners and Blackfield from unwanted attention. If word spread about what had been harbored here, the consequences could be severe, not just social ostracism, but possible intervention by authorities who might not understand the delicate balance of forces involved. Charlotte had developed a theory that the entity's essence had become so intertwined with the Turner bloodline that some connection persisted despite the original creature's removal. She began researching genealogical purification rituals from various traditions, seeking a way to sever this connection permanently. "The hunger remembers the taste of Turner blood," she explained to James one evening as they reviewed her notes. "For generations it fed primarily on your family. That creates a sympathetic bond, almost like a compass needle always pointing to its natural match." William seized on this idea with unexpected enthusiasm. "Then we can redirect it," he suggested during one of their consultations. "Find another ... host." James shut down this line of thinking immediately. "That's precisely the kind of thinking that created this situation, William. Redirecting the hunger would only create a new bargain, a new cycle of feeding and dependency." August brought a heat wave that seemed to accelerate the mansion's deterioration. The black residue became tacky in the humidity, emitting a faint odor of decay that no amount of incense or perfume could mask. Servants refused to work inside altogether, setting up makeshift kitchens in the garden pavilion and limiting their duties to the exterior grounds. The Turner family retreated to the mansion's 3rd floor, the only area still relatively untouched by the spreading contamination. William and Margaret maintained a brittle facade of normalcy, hosting scaled-down garden parties where guests were carefully prevented from entering the house itself. In early September, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Isabel, who had maintained contact with the couriers transporting the entity back to Brazil, arrived in Blackfield with news. "The Akuma Mama has reached its destination," she informed James and Charlotte. "The temple guardians performed the reintegration ritual 3 weeks ago. The entity has rejoined the greater whole from which it was separated." "And the echo here?" James asked, hope mingling with skepticism. "Already weakening," Isabel confirmed, "but not gone. The final severance requires closing the circle. Blood opened this path. Blood must close it." Her solution was elegant in its symmetry, a reversal ritual that would essentially feed the echo one last time. Not with life force, but with a mixture she called the death of hunger, a combination of symbolic elements, representing satiation, completion, and farewell. Crucial to this mixture was blood freely given by a Turner, not as sacrifice or bargain, but as relinquishment, a formal surrender of the connection their ancestors had established. William balked initially. "Haven't we given enough? Our prosperity, our standing in the community, now our blood again?" "Your ancestors took prosperity that wasn't naturally theirs," Charlotte reminded him sharply. "They fed that thing for generations, maintaining their wealth through what amounts to parasitism. This isn't about giving more. It's about formally ending the arrangement." Ultimately, it was Margaret who stepped forward. "I'll do it," she said, surprising them all. "I married into this family knowing nothing of its true nature. For my children to have any future, this must end." The ritual took place during the harvest moon, a deliberate echo of the traditional feast that had for so long marked the entity's major feeding. In the ruins of the old kitchen, Isabel prepared a circle of symbols drawn with a mixture of ash, salt, and herbs. At its center stood a clay bowl inscribed with markings similar to those that had covered the chest. Margaret stood at the edge of the circle, her face set with determination. At Isabel's instruction, she stepped forward, extended her hand over the bowl, and spoke words of formal renunciation, disavowing the bargain made by Jeremiah Turner, acknowledging the wrong done, and surrendering any claim to unnatural prosperity. James made a precise incision across her palm. 7 drops of blood fell into the mixture Isabel had prepared, 1 for each decade the bargain had stood. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Throughout the house, the black residues seemed to shiver, then contract. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the mansion for months lightened, as if a storm had finally broken. "It is done," Isabel said simply. "The echo will fade now. The hunger has been acknowledged and released." In the days that followed, the physical evidence of the entity's presence gradually diminished. The stains dried and flaked away, leaving behind only faint discolorations that could be mistaken for ordinary water damage. The dreams receded, replaced by normal sleep. The Turner estate would never regain its supernatural fertility, but neither would it remain tainted by the horror that had sustained it for so long. A new equilibrium had been established, one based on natural law rather than eldritch bargain. 1 year later, as autumn painted the Massachusetts hills in crimson and gold, James sat on the porch of his small house on the edge of Blackfield, reviewing his journal. He had documented the entire Turner affair in meticulous detail, though he kept this record secured under lock and key, uncertain if the world was ready for such truths. Charlotte had departed from medical school in Boston, her experiences with the entity having crystallized her desire to understand the boundaries between life and death, health and disease. Her letters arrived regularly, filled with observations that seamlessly blended conventional medical knowledge with insights gleaned from their confrontation with forces beyond normal understanding. The Turner family had adapted to their new circumstances with varying degrees of grace. William had eventually sold portions of their land to cover mounting debts, his pride bending to necessity. Margaret had emerged as the family's unexpected strength, managing their reduced circumstances with practical efficiency and a newfound humility that earned respect from townsfolk who had long resented the Turners' inexplicable good fortune. Most surprisingly, the mansion itself had been transformed. After extensive renovations to remove any trace of the contamination, Margaret had converted the East Wing into a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients, working with James to establish treatment protocols that combined modern medical approaches with traditional healing practices Isabel had taught them. The sealed kitchen and its surroundings had been demolished completely, the ground beneath salted and covered with a garden of protective herbs. No new structure would ever stand on that spot, a precaution Isabel had insisted upon. James often wondered about the entity itself, now returned to its distant temple. Had it rejoined some greater whole, as Isabel described, becoming once again a natural force in balance with the world around it? Or did some awareness remain, some memory of its time in Massachusetts and the human lives it had consumed. These questions would likely remain unanswered, and perhaps that was for the best. Some knowledge came at too high a price, a lesson that Turners had learned across generations. As dusk fell and lamps were lit across town, James made one final entry in his journal. The Turner affair concludes not with triumph but with restoration of natural order. What their ancestor took through greed has been returned through sacrifice. The hunger that haunted their bloodline is now severed, the bargain formally closed. Yet I remain vigilant. The world contains more wonders and horrors than our rational minds wish to acknowledge. Forces exist beyond our understanding, ancient appetites that view humanity as we view livestock. The entity may be gone, but others like it surely exist. My experience as temporary keeper changed me in ways I'm still discovering. My senses have sharpened, particularly to imbalances between natural and unnatural states. Patients remark on my intuitive understanding of their ailments, unaware that I gained this insight by briefly channeling a hunger older than civilization itself. Charlotte shows similar sensitivities, though manifesting differently. Her letters describe an uncanny ability to diagnose conditions her professors cannot explain. We who touched the hunger directly have been marked by it, though not in the way the Turners were. I sometimes dream of South America, of ancient temples where the boundary between worlds grows thin. In these dreams I feel the weight of the key against my chest, a phantom reminder of responsibility accepted and relinquished. The sealed kitchen door no longer exists, yet in these dreams I still stand before it, hearing movement on the other side. But now, rather than fear, I feel a strange acceptance, an understanding that such doors exist throughout our world, containing forces that maintain cosmic balance. Some doors are meant to remain closed. Some hungers are meant to be sated elsewhere in their proper place and proportion. The Turners learned this truth too late. May their experience serve as warning to those who seek prosperity without labor, abundance without natural cause. Every feast has its price. Every harvest requires sacrifice. The only question is whether that sacrifice is made with understanding or ignorance of its true recipient. James closed the journal and locked it in its special compartment beneath the floorboards. Outside, the harvest moon rose full and bright over Blackfield, illuminating fields that yielded exactly what nature intended, no more, no less. The bargain was ended. The hunger was gone. But somewhere in the darkness beyond his lamplight, other doors remained sealed against other hungers. Other families maintained other bargains. And in mansions across New England, other kitchens held secrets behind doors that should never be opened.